I remember the panic attacks, the debilitating anxiety, the sense that everything I loved was crumbling. For months, I coped in any way I could, moving from medications to unhealthy drinking. This kind of emotional crisis, the sense that something inside of us is wrong, this is rapidly becoming the norm. Now I wonder, is it possible that we're all living with systems of habits that are perfectly designed to produce this kind of life? The modern world is a habit formation machine. We wake up and we scroll social media. From waiting in line at the grocery store to stopping at a red light, we fill every idle moment with technology. We spend our day distracted by notifications. We rarely sit down to talk face to face. We rarely take time to rest. The problem with all these habits is not that any one of them is so bad, it's that they're all unconscious. This technological life, the one that was supposed to set us free, actually enslaves us to meaningless lives of distraction. What if instead we designed habits that pushed us towards a life of meaning and love? Isn't that what we're meant for?
Hey, how's it going? Come on in. You remember back in 2018 when my wife Sarah was diagnosed with breast cancer and she had a bunch of surgeries and went through chemo, and that was the same year that I lost two parents. I lost my dad and my stepmom to various illnesses and so on. And ever since that year, there was like this sort of loss of self-discipline that I had. I've just kind of lost the energy to resist giving my body what it wanted, every pleasure that I wanted. But what I found out is that giving my body the pleasure it wanted, it didn't make my wife's cancer go away, and it didn't get my parents back. Justin Earley says, "There will always be a kind of pain you can't soothe by eating." Now, COVID has totally exacerbated this whole thing. Over the last 2 years, we've eaten more, we've drunk more, we've watched more TV, we binge watched more movies, we've smoked more. I know that I've done many of these things, way more than I should. We've become overall just way less disciplined. It's like the energy that we have to have good habits has totally disappeared. You remember back in the hot vax summer of 2021 when we all had been vaccinated and we stopped doing masks and all that sort of stuff? Well, that summer I started eating out again. I started getting together with friends again, and I put on 15 pounds in 3 months. But even though I was connecting with all these people, I still wasn't feeling better. This reminds me of John's first letter in the New Testament, where he says, "For the world offers only a craving for physical pleasure, a craving for everything we see, and pride in our achievements and possessions. They're not from the Father, but are from this world." You know, I think that we're tempted to believe that if we could just fulfill that craving that we have, if we could just eat that thing or possess that thing or consume that thing, then we'd be happy. But what we found out is that it doesn't fill the hole that's inside of us. These things just leave us more empty than we were before. Before long, we build a habit of giving ourselves whatever our body wants, giving ourselves whatever pleasure we want. These habits have become the way that we live. And in the process, we become the kind of person that just is always fulfilling everything that we want. Actually, the problem is that they don't just not fill us, they leave us more depleted than we were before. Justin Earley says, "We're all living according to a specific regimen of habits, and those habits shape most of our life." Now, Justin wrote a book called The Common Rule, and it's the book that this series is based on. We're calling it a Common Rule Challenge because following this common rule is quite a challenge. Justin was a missionary kid, and he came back to the United States and eventually became a lawyer. In the process, he developed a whole bunch of habits that weren't serving him well, and he had an emotional breakdown. in which case he decided to do an evaluation of his whole life and all of his habits and ended up developing this common rule that he's written this book about. You can learn all about the common rule at the website commonrule.org. But Justin says, what if true freedom comes from choosing the right limitations, not avoiding all limitations? Through this series, one of the key verses from the Bible that resonates with me is Paul's letter to the Romans. Paul is the first missionary of the church, wrote a bunch of letters that ended up in the Bible. And in chapter 6, he says this, "Don't you realize that you become the slave of whatever you choose to obey? You can be a slave to sin, which leads to death, or you can choose to obey God, which leads to righteous living." In other words, I think Paul's saying, listen, if you don't have any limitations, you think you'll have true freedom, but you'll really be a slave to death. If you choose the right limitations, what you'll end up with is a righteous living, a right living, a good life before God. Now, Justin developed 8 habits that make up this common rule. And these 8 habits help us resist certain things and embrace other things. And there's all kinds of ways you can think about these 8 habits, but the easiest categories are there are 4 daily habits and 4 weekly habits. The 4 daily habits are this: kneeling prayer 3 times a day, 1 meal with others every day, 1 hour with your phone off, and engaging scripture before your phone. And then there's 4 weekly habits, which are 1 hour of conversation with a friend each week, curating your media to 4 hours, fasting from something for 24 hours, and taking a day of rest. The 2 weekly habits we're going to look at today are fasting from something for 24 hours and curating your media, or reducing your consumption of media down to 4 hours a week. Now, those are some serious challenges, which is why we've called this the Common Rule Challenge. Resisting consuming everything so that we can embrace something else, it's hard work. But they're habits, I think, that are going to pay off in the long haul for righteous, for right, for good living. Both of these are about resisting what we fill ourselves with so that we can embrace filling ourselves with a love for God and love for others. The first thing I'm going to cover is fasting in general, and then I'm going to cover the habit about curating your media to few hours, because I think that's an example of a kind of fasting. But before we dive into that, I've got a question for you. How much time do you spend consuming, and what kind of person is that forming you to become? Let's talk about that. Now, we don't have a lot of experience with fasting in our culture, so this is going to be a serious challenge to pick up fasting from something for 24 hours. In fact, our habits of consumption are so ingrained in us that when I sat down to read this chapter in Justin's book and begin working on this message, the first thing that I did was I got up and I went to the pantry to get a snack. And I didn't even realize the irony of it till I sat back down, opened up the chapter, started eating my snack, and reading about fasting. Jesus says, when you fast. Now that's really interesting. He's in the Sermon on the Mount, and he doesn't explain how to fast, the mechanics of it. He talks about the spiritual side of fasting, but he doesn't explain exactly how to do it. And he doesn't do that because he assumes that you already know how to fast. In fact, Jesus' whole culture did this on a regular basis. But for most of us, probably the last time that we fasted was fasting for a blood test. Now, that's not the kind of fasting that we're talking about here. In fact, we're also not talking about fasting as a way to lose weight, or we're not talking about different eating disorders like bulimia or anorexia. This is fasting from food for a set period of time. If you wrestle with those things, seek help from a counselor, maybe our counselor, Damaris Garcia. Here's a really simple definition of fasting. Fasting is choosing to resist filling ourselves with food for a period of time to embrace filling ourselves with love for God and others. At its simplest, fasting is choosing to not eat one meal, to skip one meal, and spend that time in prayer. Now, we try to fill this emptiness in us with food, literally and spiritually, but Justin reminds us we were made to feast, not in order to become full, but because we are full. We're to celebrate that fullness by feasting. Feasting to fill the emptiness is not feasting, it's coping. Now, fasting reveals several different things. And the first thing that it reveals is it reveals what's inside of me. It reveals my own needs. Whatever is deep down in there, it comes up when we fast. Justin says, we eat to try to fill our emptiness. Fasting is a way to resist the original sin of trying to eat our way to happiness and to force ourselves to look to God for our fullness. And then he goes on to say, in fasting, we deliberately move downward into emptiness, seeing who you really are. Whatever is there, whatever is underneath in our character, the good, the bad, and the ugly, it comes out when we fast because we don't have the energy reserves to constantly be managing how we come across to other people. Justin talks about one of his favorite things to do when he's driving home is to think about what he's going to eat. But on the day that he's fasting, what he's thinking about is actually how he's going to serve his family on his way home. And he has this really unique quirk. He actually likes to, get this, cook for others while he's fasting. That's crazy. It's almost sadistic. Now, you don't have to go that far with fasting, but pay attention to what comes up when you fast. Because fasting reveals what's down there, what's underneath, deep in our soul. Fasting not only reveals my needs, but it also reveals the world's needs. That's because when we fast, when we choose to voluntarily be hungry, we, in solidarity with those who are hungry involuntarily, experience a kind of suffering with them, a kind of pain with them. We choose to take on the suffering of the world in our bodies when we fast, in the way that Jesus took on the suffering of the world when he hung on the cross. Our voluntary hunger pains remind us that some people are hungry involuntarily. The poor family in your neighborhood, the person who's under siege in a Ukrainian city, the family that is on the streets and doesn't have enough money to buy food for their kids. Fasting is a way of representing injustice in our bodies, to suffer with those who suffer. Sometimes I hear Christians talk about fasting as if it's a way of kind of strong-arming God into giving them some sort of favor, giving them what they think they want or need. But that's not what fasting is all about. Fasting is about joining Jesus in his suffering for the suffering of the world. Remember, fasting is choosing to resist filling ourselves with food, to embrace filling ourselves with love for God and others. Now, this is a serious challenge to weekly fast from food for 24 hours. So I'm going to give you some next step challenges. You can go as deep into this challenge as you want, but here's some ways to sort of zero entry into it. Pick something to fast from. Something, anything, food, social media, Mountain Dew if you're Pastor Mark. Or just simply fast from one meal. Or fast from sundown to sundown. Now that's a 24-hour fast. Basically, you eat dinner on one night, and then you fast from breakfast, fast from lunch, and you break the fast at dinner the next day. You skip 2 meals when you fast for 24 hours. And that's what Justin is challenging us to do with the Common Rule Challenge. Consider fasting with others. Don't just do it by yourself, but do it with a small group. Do it with a challenge partner. Instead of spending time eating, spend that time instead praying. And if you've practiced fasting on a regular basis already, then take it up a step and fast for not just 24 hours, but maybe 48 hours. Now here's a question for you. What's your experience with fasting, and what next step can you take in this challenge? Let's talk about that. All right, so we've been talking about resisting food, resisting filling ourselves with junk food so that we can embrace filling ourselves with a love of God and a love of others. But now I want to talk about the second weekly challenge, the second weekly habit of curating your media to 4 hours. Now, this is a serious challenge, friends. I've been trying this for a couple of months now, and here's what I've noticed. Sometimes I get onto Amazon, and maybe you've had this experience with Netflix or Hulu, where you scroll for an hour trying to find something to watch, and then you end up not watching anything. It's absolutely crazy. It reminds me of being in a bookstore, and there are so many books and so little time. Or going into a hardware store, and all you need is a teeny little screw, but there's millions of screws. Or going into the drugstore and you need some new toothpaste and there are too many choices of toothpaste. So maybe you think, I'll get online and I'll order it there, and that's supposed to make it easier, right? Nope. There are even more choices. You see, this habit of curating your media to 4 hours, it's about resisting consuming all of the junk out there so that you can choose the good stories, the ones worth entering into. Remember, Justin says, what if true freedom comes from choosing the right limitations, not avoiding all limitations? So today's challenge is to curate your media to 4 hours. We're going to resist limitless media so that we can embrace the stories worth entering into. We're going to resist the junk stories to embrace the good stories. Now, media is a kind of telling of stories. I'm telling you a story, Randy's helping here with the video, you're watching it on the other end. And when I think about media, I think about Neil Gaiman and his book, American Gods, which was turned into a TV show by the same name. It tells the story of Shadow, kind of the main protagonist, and he has a bunch of different gods, American gods, who are trying to get him on their side in a war for the heart of every American. And Shadow goes into a department store and he ends up encountering the god of media on a TV. Watch and listen.
Talking to Lucille Ball.
Lucy Ricardo. I'm all sword, Shadow. The screen's the altar. I'm the one they sacrifice to. Then till now. Golden age to golden age. They sit side by side, ignore each other, and give it up to me. Now they hold a smaller screen in their lap or in the palm of their hand so they don't get bored watching the big one. Time and attention. Better than lamb's blood.
Did you catch what she said at the very end there? She said, time and attention are better than lamb's blood. Now, what's she referencing? She's referencing actually the sacrifice of lambs on the altar in the Old Testament or in many religious traditions. And she's saying that time and attention are like the sacrifice of a lamb on an altar, but not to the God of the universe. It's rather the God of media. Stories are a form of worship, and we become what we worship. Justin says, we become the stories we consume. We become them because we don't just watch stories, we live in one. Now here's the crazy thing about streaming stories. They're not just always available. They are targeted, they are geared to grab your attention and to pull you in when you are trying to focus your attention elsewhere. We are guaranteed to be formed by consumption if we don't ruthlessly pursue curation. Justin says, the good life doesn't come in the ability to choose anything and everything. The good life comes from the ability to choose the good things by setting limits. Now, admittedly, the limit of 4 hours is an arbitrary limit. But here's what I've learned trying to practice this over the last several months. If you don't set an exact number, this habit just doesn't happen. Our habits are so ingrained in our culture of consuming media that they just begin to fill every little aspect of our life, every extra moment we have. So maybe 4 hours isn't perfect for you, but pick a set number of hours, a lot fewer than you consume right now, and aim for that. Remember, we're going to resist limitless consumption of media so that we can embrace entering into the good stories. We're going to resist the junk stories to embrace the good stories. Now, Justin offers 3 ways to curate for the good stories. The first is to curate for beauty. In the book of Genesis, at the very beginning of the story of the Bible, we read, "The Lord God made all sorts of trees grow up from the ground, trees that were beautiful and that produced delicious fruit." It's interesting that before sin even entered into the world, food was beautiful. It didn't just taste good, it looked good. You think about that phrase, feast your eyes on this. The stomach was made to hunger for food, but the eye was made to hunger for beauty. Beauty moves truth from the head to the heart. Or as John says in his letter, "For the world offers only a craving for physical pleasure, a craving for everything we see." John is saying we crave everything we see, every novelty, every distraction. Oh wait, look, there's a bird. One way I've tried to live into this is to not fill every crevice of my life with media consumption. You think about when you're standing in line at the grocery store and we so quickly pull out our phones to pass the time. Or when you're waiting for somebody to pick you up, you pull out your phone and you just scroll through social media. Or I'm a bit embarrassed to mention it, but when I'm sitting on the toilet. We all should become a little more Buddhist in this way. When you go to the bathroom, go to the bathroom. When you're waiting in line, wait in line. I've slowly but eventually totally deleted all of the video apps off of my phone. That's because when I engage media on my computer, when I intentionally engage media in that form, I tend to choose things that are more beautiful than just a quick fix or quick hit of a TikTok video. The second way we curate our stories is for justice. In the Old Testament, there's this concept of shalom, which is usually translated as peace. But it's not just a negative peace, as in the absence of war, as if Russia stopped invading Ukraine and wasn't sending missiles at residential targets. Rather, it's a positive peace. It's a peace of flourishing, of thriving for everyone around. And when you're trying to curate your media for this sort of understanding, this sort of world, it's probably not going to happen with the free stuff that you can just scroll through. It's probably going to be more in form of long-form journalism. And in all likelihood, this is the kind of stuff you're probably going to have to pay for. It's not going to be free. When we curate stories we consume for justice, what we're looking for is the stories that stir our hearts to the vulnerable in our world. The third way to curate your stories is to curate them for community. Imagine if over the next week, the only videos, the only media that you engaged was media that you consumed with other people around you, with your family or with a friend. There's something totally qualitatively different about me sitting on this couch back here with my boys watching a movie and talking and laughing about it than me sitting back here on this couch all by myself watching and consuming media. Or on a date night, watching a movie with my wife and then talking about it versus me sitting right here watching a movie by myself. Something very different about media consumption when we do it with community. All right, in the same way that this is a serious challenge, and I gave you a sort of zero entry set of options for fasting, let's talk about some next step options for curating your media to 4 hours a week. First, do a media audit. Actually sit down and track how many hours did you engage media this week, and then pick a limit. 4 hours. Maybe that works for you, or maybe it doesn't. Whatever it is, pick a lot few hours than you consume right now. Curate for beauty, curate for justice, curate for community. And then maybe like me, you need to delete some apps off your phone. So here's a question for you. What's your challenge next step for curating the media that you consume? Let's talk about that. So let's go back to the whole point of this entire series. What if freedom comes from choosing the right limitations, not avoiding all limitations. A couple weeks ago, we went down to visit my family in Florida, and we had an awesome time. And when we got back, it was a Monday afternoon, and I was unpacking everything and got it all ready, and I was really debating, like, should I start working right now, or should I wait until Tuesday morning? So I talked to Sarah, and she said, listen, it's gonna drive you crazy if you don't get ready for the week today. So I sat down here at my desk, and I opened up my computer, and I started working. And as I'm here working, my youngest son, Sam, comes in, and he plops down on the couch, and he says, Dad, I'm bored. Well, what are you bored about? There's no shuffleboard, there's no pool table, there's no croquet, there's no pickleball. So I'm thinking in my mind that he's not really bored for the reason that he says he's bored. He's bored because on vacation, I made an intentional decision to entirely disengage from media. I didn't watch one video. I didn't open social media once. I didn't even take my computer with me. I left it here for that whole week. And I was fully present, completely and totally present to him and all of my family. I brought 3 novels and I read 2 of them. That was the kind of engagement I had. And we had an absolutely spectacular time. We went to the pool. We played on a pool table, which the kids absolutely love because we don't have one of those. We ate a ton of ice cream. Sarah and I went out on a wonderful date night. We spent the next morning kayaking. We visited family and met my newest family member, Eva Arthur. So I looked at Sam and I said, I think the reason that you're bored is because you don't have 4 adults who have given you their full attention. And I'd be bored too. So here's the good news. You don't have to go to Florida, and you don't have to be on vacation to make some decisions about your media consumption to really be present to the people that you love. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to not eat so as to fill ourselves with the love of God and others. We're going to resist the junk stories to embrace the good stories. So for the sake of love of God and others, this week, fast from something for 24 hours and curate your media to 4 hours. Now that's going to be hard, so let me pray for you. God, give us the strength, give us the wisdom, give us the creativity, give us the self-discipline to have these new habits. Habits that are the good life, that are righteous life, that love you and love others. In the name of Jesus and the power of the Spirit, all who agreed said, Amen.